The last time human boots touched the moon, Richard Nixon was still in the White House, Apollo 17 was wrapping up, and America still looked like a country that might keep going forever. Then the footprint stopped. December 1972 became the end of an era that was supposed to feel like a beginning, and for more than 50 years the most powerful spacefaring nation on Earth never put another person back on the lunar surface. This is why the story feels so strange. Humanity did not walk away from space. It built stations, flew shuttles, launched probes, lived in orbit, and kept pushing machines deeper into the solar system. On April 1, 2026, NASA launched Artemis II, the first crewed mission to head around the moon in more than 50 years. The crew flew past the moon on April 6, and NASA set return operations for April 10. Even now, after all that time, the world is still treating a lunar flyby like a historic comeback. That tells you everything about how deep the gap really is. And that gap was never about forgetting the way. It was about something harder to admit. Apollo was a sprint built for a Cold War deadline. Once the flag was planted and the political objective was met, the money dropped, the urgency faded, the hardware lines closed, and the moon stopped being a program America was willing to fund again and again. The question is not why we forgot how to go back. The question is why the richest country on Earth decided it no longer needed to. The first thing to understand is that Apollo was never built to be normal. People talk about the moon landings now like they were the first chapter of a long future, like NASA reached the surface in 1969 and naturally should have kept running the same play every few years after that. The truth is harsher than that. Apollo was a political mobilization disguised as a space program, a national emergency effort built to win a Cold War contest in front of the whole world. That matters more than almost anything else in this story. NASA's own historical framing makes the point pretty clearly: Apollo existed inside extraordinary circumstances that were unlikely to return under normal politics. The mission was not simply scientific curiosity. It was a demonstration of industrial power, engineering discipline, military-adjacent technology, and national prestige at a moment when the United States believed it had to prove superiority fast. The moon was the stage, though the real audience was Earth. And once you see Apollo that way, the scale of it starts to make more sense. This was not a modest exploration program slowly building toward permanence. It was a surge. NASA's budget reached an extraordinary share of the federal government in the mid-1960s, a level the agency itself later treated as a historical anomaly rather than a sustainable baseline. The United States was pouring money into rockets, launch facilities, test stands, training pipelines, computers, guidance systems, and an industrial network wide enough to keep an entire lunar architecture alive at high speed. That is why the most common modern question is a little off target. People ask why NASA stopped going back as if the agency had a stable moon program and then simply lost interest. A better question is why anyone ever believed that level of effort would continue once the central objective had been achieved. Apollo was designed to hit a deadline, plant a flag, bring the crew home, and prove something larger than exploration itself. It was a sprint with national survival energy behind it, even if it did not look that way on camera. By the time later missions were flying, the deeper problem had already started to show. Winning the race is a very different thing from funding the road after the race is over. Once the United States had beaten the Soviet Union to the moon, the political logic that justified Apollo began to weaken. A moon landing was no longer an unfinished promise. It was a completed demonstration. The urgency that built Saturn V and sent astronauts across cislunar space did not vanish in one day, though it did begin to drain almost immediately. And that is the hidden setup for everything that comes next. The moon landings looked like the beginning of a permanent future, though they were actually the peak of a temporary coalition. They required rare political focus, giant spending, manufacturing cadence, public tolerance for risk, and a government willing to treat lunar exploration like a top-tier strategic mission. When people say we have not been back in more than 50 years, what they are really describing is the aftermath of a country deciding that Apollo-level effort would never be normal again. The tragedy is that the moon made the future look easy. Apollo created the illusion that once humanity crossed that distance, the rest would unfold on schedule. Bases would come next. Then outposts. Then routine missions. Then Mars. Instead, the first giant leap ended up hiding a brutal truth. Getting to the moon once is a miracle of mobilization. Staying in the moon business is a political and industrial commitment that has to survive long after the applause fades. That commitment is the part America did not keep. Apollo looks permanent when you watch it in reverse. Mission after mission, bigger rockets, cleaner landings, calmer crews, stronger hardware. It feels like the beginning of a road that should have stretched straight into the future. In real time, it was already starting to narrow. The moon landings did not stop in one dramatic moment. They were trimmed, reduced, and quietly pushed toward an ending while the public was still treating them like the center of the space age. That is the part people usually miss. The final landing was not planned as the final landing from the start. NASA had more lunar missions on the board. The system still existed. The rockets were real. The crews were training. The machinery for more surface expeditions had been built at enormous cost. Then the cancellation started. Apollo 20 was cut first, and later missions were stripped away under budget pressure until Apollo 17 became the last human landing on the moon in December 1972. That ending was not mysterious. It was administrative. And that kind of ending almost feels wrong for something so historic. People expect the moon era to end with catastrophe, fear, or a great national debate. Instead, it ends the way many huge programs end. The political objective had been met, the budget environment had changed, and the case for doing the same expensive thing again and again became harder to sell. Once America had won the race, each new lunar landing had less shock value than the one before it. The hardware still worked. The coalition behind it did not. That budget collapse is one of the most important facts in the whole story. During Apollo's peak years, NASA operated with a share of federal spending that looked nothing like the world that came after. By the mid-1970s, the agency was working inside a much smaller fiscal box, and the kind of giant sustained lunar cadence needed for regular moon landings no longer matched political reality. A moon program is not just a rocket and a capsule. It is a living industrial chain that has to stay hot. Once the money cools, the whole thing starts to die. That chain was massive. It meant launch vehicles, command modules, lunar modules, engines, guidance systems, support crews, contractors, test stands, fuel systems, recovery teams, training facilities, mission planners, and a workforce that knew how to move from one flight to the next without losing rhythm. Apollo functioned at a pace that kept knowledge attached to practice. Once that pace stopped, knowledge stayed on paper while capability began to decay in the real world. That is a major difference, and it explains a lot of the 50-year gap. So when people say NASA lost the technology, that is too simple. The real answer is more frustrating. The United States did not lose the basic knowledge of how lunar missions worked. It allowed the production lines to close, the flight cadence to vanish, and the specialized industrial muscle to atrophy. A recipe can survive in a binder. That does not mean the kitchen is still staffed, the ovens are still on, or the supply chain still exists to make dinner tonight. There is also a psychological piece here. Apollo trained the public to see the moon as a solved problem. That was one of its great achievements, and one of its strangest side effects. The first landing felt impossible. The later landings felt impressive, though less world-shaking. Success can flatten wonder. By the time astronauts were driving rovers across the lunar surface and bringing back serious science, some of the political electricity had already leaked away. The nation had proved it could do it. Repeating that proof did not hit with the same force. And once the logic shifted from prove we can to explain why we should keep paying, Apollo entered dangerous territory. That is where programs become vulnerable. The moon landings were still technologically extraordinary, though the surrounding argument had changed. They no longer fit the same national mood, the same budget culture, or the same strategic urgency that had created them in the first place. America had not turned against space. It had turned away from one very specific kind of expensive space effort. So the last landing was never really the whole ending. The true ending was the loss of continuity. After Apollo 17, there was no stable lunar rhythm left to protect. No regular missions. No preserved landing cadence. No political class treating the moon as a standing national priority. That is why December 1972 matters so much. It was not only the last time humans touched the lunar surface. It was the moment the United States let a functioning moon architecture slide out of active life and into history. America did not stop flying in space after Apollo. It chose a different destination. That distinction matters. The end of lunar landings can make it sound like the United States turned inward, lost interest, or simply gave up on human spaceflight. None of that is really true. What changed was the organizing idea. Once the moon stopped serving as the main Cold War prize, Washington began steering human spaceflight toward low Earth orbit, where missions looked more reusable, more practical, and easier to justify year after year. The future was still in space. It just was no longer being built on the lunar surface. You can see that pivot almost immediately in the hardware itself. NASA did not take the post-Apollo years and pour the leftovers into more landings. It reused parts of the Apollo world in different ways. Skylab is the perfect example. Instead of another run of lunar expeditions, one of the last Saturn V rockets launched America's first space station in 1973. Apollo-era technology was still alive, though it was already being redirected away from the moon and toward long-duration living and working in orbit. That is a huge turning point in this story. A lunar landing campaign demands enormous bursts of money, specialized hardware, and a public willing to fund repeated deep space missions with no short-term payoff beyond prestige, science, and long-range exploration. An orbital program sells itself differently. A station can be framed as infrastructure. A shuttle can be marketed as a reusable transportation system. Low Earth orbit feels closer, safer, more flexible, and more connected to national research, defense-adjacent capability, and international cooperation. In political terms, orbit is easier to defend than the moon. Then came the Space Shuttle, and with it a whole new vision of what human spaceflight was supposed to be. In January 1972, even before the last moon landing had happened, President Nixon approved the shuttle program. That timing tells you a lot. America was already choosing its next model before Apollo had fully closed. The new bet was not permanent lunar return. It was a reusable spacecraft meant to make access to orbit more routine, more useful, and more politically sustainable than another Apollo-style sprint. On paper, that looked like the future. The shuttle promised a system that could launch astronauts, carry satellites, conduct research, support defense payloads, and eventually help build larger structures in space. It fit a country that still wanted ambition, though wanted it inside a tighter budget and a steadier rhythm. Apollo had been a thunderclap. Shuttle was sold as an operating system. The idea was not to stun the world once. The idea was to create a reusable backbone for everything that came next in orbit. That shift also changed what counted as progress. During Apollo, progress meant distance, landing, and national spectacle. In the new era, progress meant launch frequency, payload delivery, orbital research, and eventually space station assembly. The moon had offered a dramatic finish line. Low Earth orbit offered a permanent workload. That made it less cinematic, though far easier to fold into annual budgets and long-range federal planning. Instead of arguing for a new flag and footprints moment every few years, NASA could argue for transportation, laboratories, and infrastructure above Earth. By the 1980s, that logic deepened again. Ronald Reagan directed NASA to build a permanently inhabited Earth orbiting station, which pushed the country even farther into the station model. That choice carried serious consequences. A permanent orbital outpost is not a side project. It demands logistics, crews, construction plans, supply lines, maintenance, political commitments, and a transportation system built to support it. Every dollar, engineer, and leadership hour spent sustaining that orbital future was attention that did not go toward rebuilding a lunar landing cadence. Then the International Space Station locked that direction in for decades. Assembly began in 1998, and from that point forward the United States and its partners were committed to a long, slow, expensive, multinational project in orbit. That station became the center of gravity for human spaceflight. Crews had to rotate. Cargo had to arrive. Systems had to be maintained. Missions had to be planned around a structure already in use. Low Earth orbit was no longer just a preference. It had become the place where human spaceflight lived. That is why the moon gap makes more sense when you stop seeing it as an absence and start seeing it as a replacement. America did not walk away from human spaceflight after Apollo. It traded one model for another. It chose stations over landings, orbit over surface operations, continuity over spectacle, and infrastructure over distant flags. The moon did not disappear from imagination, though it did disappear from the active budget coalition that actually determines what gets built. And once that choice hardened, coming back became much harder than people realized. A lunar landing program cannot survive as a memory. It needs fresh hardware, practiced crews, working suppliers, tested systems, and a political class willing to keep paying for missions beyond the first triumphant return. While America was perfecting life in orbit, the industrial muscle needed for repeated moon landings kept getting colder. That is the real cost of the pivot. The country did not just leave the moon behind. It built an entire new future somewhere else. The shuttle era was supposed to make space feel routine. That was the promise. Apollo had been a national emergency effort dressed in the language of exploration. Shuttle was sold as a system, a machine that could fly again and again, carry astronauts and cargo, and turn orbit into a working environment instead of a distant stunt. On paper, it looked like the perfect answer to the post-Apollo world. It was reusable, visible, politically marketable, and easier to defend than another expensive series of moon landings. That new model changed the center of gravity for American human spaceflight. The moon had been about reaching a destination. Shuttle was about maintaining access. Once that logic took hold, success stopped meaning boots on new ground and started meaning launches, payloads, experiments, satellite work, and eventually station support. It was a quieter kind of ambition, though it came with a powerful side effect. The deeper NASA moved into orbit, the less likely it became that lunar landings would remain an active priority instead of an old achievement. Then the accidents changed everything again. Challenger in 1986 was a national trauma, though it was also something more structural. It exposed how fragile the dream of routine spaceflight really was. A vehicle presented as an operating system for orbit had just failed in front of the whole country. The result was not simply grief. It was reform, scrutiny, procedural tightening, and a new reminder that human spaceflight does not become ordinary just because a program wants it to. Every disaster makes the future slower. Columbia in 2003 hit even closer to the question of why the moon stayed out of reach. By then, the United States had spent decades building its human spaceflight identity around shuttle operations and orbital work. Columbia shattered the illusion that this system had matured beyond deep institutional risk. Investigators pushed hard on culture, oversight, and the normalization of danger inside a large technical organization. That mattered far beyond the shuttle itself. After Columbia, any serious human exploration program faced a harder political environment, stricter certification logic, and far less patience for optimism unsupported by testing. At the same time, America was no longer just flying missions in orbit. It was building a permanent home there. The International Space Station became a multi-decade commitment that demanded constant labor, constant launches, constant funding, and constant attention. Once assembly began in 1998, human spaceflight was no longer centered on reaching somewhere new. It was centered on maintaining something already alive above Earth. Crews rotated through. Cargo had to arrive on time. Repairs mattered. Planning cycles stretched years ahead. Orbit was no longer a bridge. It was the main address. That matters for the moon story more than many people realize. A station is not just a science project. It is an organizing machine. It absorbs money, workforce, logistics, engineering hours, and political capital. It creates its own gravity. Once the United States committed to shuttle-supported station building and then long-term station operations, the path back to the moon became harder every year. Not impossible, though harder. The country was still investing in human spaceflight. It was simply investing in the kind that stayed close to Earth and produced continuous visible work. This is why the gap between Apollo and Artemis feels so long. It was filled with activity, though not with landings. Americans flew in orbit, assembled a station, learned to live in space for long durations, expanded international cooperation, and kept human spaceflight alive through an entirely different model. That model had value. It produced science, operational experience, and real technical progress. It also pushed lunar surface operations farther into the realm of someday. The moon was not forgotten. It was displaced by a system that kept renewing itself every budget cycle. And once disaster, oversight, and permanent orbital infrastructure all fused together, the old Apollo mindset was truly gone. No modern moon return could be sold as a quick sequel to 1969. It had to survive a far more cautious age, one shaped by commissions, reviews, safety boards, schedule slips, and hard questions about cost. That is the long middle of this story. The United States did not spend 50 years doing nothing. It spent 50 years building a version of human spaceflight that made the moon harder to reach again, even while keeping the dream alive. If Apollo ended with a budget cliff, the decades after Apollo became a cycle of restarts. America never completely abandoned the idea of going back to the moon. The idea kept returning. Presidents brought it back. NASA studies brought it back. New architectures brought it back. Congress brought it back. Yet almost every attempt ran into the same brutal problem. The ambition was large, the politics shifted, the funding never felt secure enough, and the program had to keep changing shape before it could reach the surface again. One of the clearest early examples came in 1989 with the Space Exploration Initiative. On paper, it looked like the kind of major national reset that could finally reopen the lunar path. It talked about going beyond low Earth orbit and putting the moon back inside the national imagination. Then the price estimates hit. NASA's own historical treatment of the initiative makes the central point hard to miss. The projected long-term cost helped trigger a hostile reaction, and the plan collapsed under the weight of affordability and politics before it could become a durable program. The dream returned, then slammed into the budget wall again. That pattern matters. The moon was easy to endorse in speeches, though much harder to protect in appropriations. A return plan sounds exciting when it is still made of goals, slogans, and concept art. It becomes vulnerable the second it turns into real hardware, multi-year schedules, and giant bills that must survive changing administrations. That is one of the main reasons the moon kept drifting away. It was never short on rhetoric. It was short on sustained political consensus at the price level a real landing program demanded. After Columbia, the idea came back again in a new form. The 2004 vision for space exploration tried to push human spaceflight beyond low Earth orbit with a more methodical logic, something NASA itself framed less as a race and more as a journey. That difference in tone is important. Apollo had been built around urgency. This new era was trying to build under caution. The problem was that caution does not make programs cheap. It usually makes them longer, more layered, and more dependent on steady backing over time. A slow path can still fail if the coalition behind it never becomes strong enough. Then came Constellation, another serious moon return architecture, and with it one of the most revealing moments in the whole post-Apollo story. In 2009, the Augustine Committee looked at the program and found what had haunted so many lunar reboots already: the goals and the resources did not line up. That finding is central to the 50-year gap. It means the delay was not mainly about imagination or technical ignorance. It was about trying to build a deep space human program on a political and financial base too weak to carry its promises. The plans were often real. The long-term support behind them was not strong enough. That is where the story starts to get more complicated, since failure did not mean total retreat. After the turbulence around Constellation, Congress and the executive branch did not simply walk away from deep space exploration. Instead, the path was rebuilt again. The NASA Authorization Act of 2010 helped lock in a new backbone for the future, especially through the Space Launch System and Orion. That move showed that lunar return had not died. It had become a legislative and architectural reconstruction project, something slower, more negotiated, and more tangled than the Apollo model people still pictured in their heads. This is why the post-Apollo period can feel confusing if you only look at it from far away. It was not a straight line of neglect. It was a maze of proposals, resets, reviews, redesigns, cancellations, and partial rebuilds. The nation kept circling the same conclusion without fully escaping it. Going back to the moon would require a coalition strong enough to survive cost shock, safety demands, oversight pressure, and election cycle churn. Again and again, that coalition formed halfway, then cracked under the burden of real execution. By the time Artemis emerged as the modern return effort, the lesson had become impossible to ignore. The moon was never going to be recovered by nostalgia alone. It would take money that lasted, hardware that matured, testing that proved itself, and a political system willing to support the mission after the first headline. That is what all the failed reboots had been teaching for decades. The barrier was never simply distance. The barrier was building a national commitment strong enough to cross the distance more than once. That brings the story to the present, and the present looks very different from the world Apollo came from. Artemis is not a simple return to an old method. It is a rebuild under modern rules, modern oversight, and modern expectations of safety. Apollo was a tightly focused national sprint built around one central objective. Artemis is a layered system that has to prove many moving parts at once before a landing can happen. That difference is one of the biggest reasons the moon gap lasted so long. The easiest mistake is to imagine Artemis as Apollo with shinier hardware. It is much more complicated than that. The modern return effort depends on Orion, the Space Launch System, lunar orbit operations, commercial landing systems, new suits, communications networks, mission integration, and a testing sequence built for a much harsher approval culture than the one Apollo flew through. In other words, America is not pulling an old machine out of storage. It is assembling a new lunar architecture almost piece by piece. That is why the word rebuild matters so much here. Knowledge can survive while capability decays. Engineers can understand the broad logic of lunar missions without having an active industrial base ready to execute them on demand. The factories, suppliers, manufacturing lines, testing habits, and flight rhythm that made Apollo possible were never preserved in a form that could simply be switched back on 50 years later. Artemis exists partly because the United States finally accepted that returning to the moon meant rebuilding a working landing ecosystem, not rediscovering a lost trick. The structure of Artemis makes that reality visible. Orion is the crew vehicle. SLS is the heavy-lift rocket backbone. Gateway is meant to support long-term lunar operations. Human landing systems bring astronauts from lunar orbit down to the surface. New suits have to function in a modern lunar campaign rather than as museum echoes of the Apollo era. Each of those pieces carries schedule risk, budget risk, technical risk, and integration risk. A landing only happens when all of them are ready at the same time, which is far harder than getting one heroic launch over the line. Safety is another major difference between then and now. Apollo flew in an era of extreme national urgency, though Artemis is being built in the shadow of decades of oversight, accident investigations, and far less public tolerance for catastrophic failure. The dossier is especially blunt on this point. Modern deep space missions face stricter certification and testing demands, and NASA oversight has stressed that if something goes catastrophically wrong on a lunar mission, there is no simple rescue option waiting in the background. That raises the burden of proof on every major subsystem before astronauts go down to the surface. That stricter environment is one reason Artemis can feel slow from the outside while making sense from the inside. Every major issue discovered in testing matters. Batteries matter. Circuitry matters. Suit readiness matters. Docking confidence matters. Lander maturity matters. The public often sees delay as drift, though in a program like this, delay can mean the system is actually behaving the way a post-Columbia, post-Challenger era expects it to behave. The path back to the moon is now gated by evidence instead of adrenaline. Even the recent architecture changes underline that point. The dossier notes NASA's February 2026 update adding a 2027 Artemis 3 mission focused on low Earth orbit systems testing, including rendezvous and docking checks and suit testing, in order to prepare for an Artemis for landing in 2028. That is the opposite of a rushed return. It is a program admitting that surface missions demand integrated confidence, not just public excitement. The moon is close enough to inspire impatience, yet far enough to punish false readiness. So Artemis is not really the sequel people imagined in the 1970s. It is the answer to a different question. Apollo asked whether the United States could reach the moon first under extraordinary pressure. Artemis asks whether a modern democracy can patiently rebuild the industrial, political, and technical foundation needed to land humans there again under normal politics. That is a much harder challenge in some ways. The rocket is only part of the story. The real mission is proving that this time the commitment can survive long enough to become more than a single historic return. So why did humans stop landing on the moon for more than 50 years? The cleanest answer is that Apollo solved the problem it had been built to solve. It proved American power, American engineering, and American technological superiority in the most visible way possible. Once that objective was achieved, the political world that had made Apollo possible began to disappear. The money fell. The urgency faded. The hardware lines cooled. The moon stopped being the center of a national emergency effort and became one option among many competing priorities. That is why the long gap was never about forgetting the route. The knowledge did not vanish. What vanished was the living system that turns knowledge into repeated landings. Factories closed. Flight cadence died. Human spaceflight pivoted toward orbit. Then decades of accidents, oversight, budget fights, and program resets made any return to the lunar surface slower, more fragile, and more politically exposed than people wanted to admit. The distance to the moon stayed the same. The kind of country willing to fund that trip over and over did not. And that is what makes Artemis so important. It is not just another mission set. It is a test of whether the United States and its partners can do something harder than Apollo in one crucial sense. Apollo had to win a sprint. Artemis has to survive a marathon. It has to prove that lunar exploration can outlast headlines, administrations, budget cycles, delays, and the slow grind of modern risk culture. A single landing would be historic. A true return would mean building a system that keeps going after the cameras move on. The moon did not become unreachable after 1972. It became unaffordable in the old way, unfashionable in the old politics, and unsustainable without a new model. That is the real reason human boot stayed away for so long. We did not lose the moon. We lost the coalition that made going there feel inevitable. Now the question is whether Artemis can build a stronger one.